Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Homeline Tenant Landlord webinar series. This is our April edition of 2025. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone. We're going to have a really awesome kind of market analysis overview of some of the rental housing here in Minnesota. So I'm going to give it just a couple, 30 seconds or so for let people come in, get themselves settled. Um, and then we'll get into some housekeeping things before we jump into a whole lot of really cool information. Okay. Okay. Looks like I'm seeing it slow down now, so I'm just going to go ahead and I have us at 1:31. So I'll go ahead and get us started. So again, if you're just joining us, thank you so much for joining us for our April edition of our ongoing webinar series on Minnesota tenant landlord law. Today we're going to be joined by Dan Hilton, who is a research manager over at HousingLink, which is a really cool nonprofit that works as a housing search function amongst many other things. I'll let Dan kind of go into that if he so chooses. Um, but we will be uh, recording this session. It will be up on our website, homelinemn.org. Um, in the next few days once we can actually, get it off the cloud and all of that good stuff. My name is Rachel and I'm an attorney here at Homeline. So if you're new to these, we've been doing these for several years now, but if you're new, Homeline is a nonprofit that helps Minnesota tenants kind of navigate what their rights are under Minnesota tenant landlord law. We've been around since 1992 and we've at this point helped over 335,000 households in that time frame. This is our contact information. We offer our services both over the phone and via email. And we have language lines. We offer our services in English, Somali, Hmong, and Spanish. So those are the various, you'll see on the screen, the various numbers for that. Um, so as I said before, this is an ongoing series. Our next session is going to be on May 21st, and we're going to be giving an overview of some of the more recent city ordinances that have passed. So a lot of the work that we do is kind of based on the state level, but there are also city ordinances that can impact Minnesota renters and landlords. So we're going to be trying to go over some of the more recent ordinances that have passed. So again, mark your calendars for May 21st. That registration is also available through our website. And like I said, promise some housekeeping. So like I said, the session is being recorded. It'll be up on the website in a few days. That should include copies of a PDF version of the slides as well. Please, if you have questions, we love your questions. We had some pre-submitted questions, but if you have questions that come up during this, please, please, please ask them away, but please use the Q&A function. If you try and put something in the chat, I will probably miss it because I will be putting a whole bunch of other links and relevant information in the chat, and so I'm going to miss it. So please use the Q&A function, and I will get to those. We'll reserve time at the end of these 90 minutes to answer the questions that you've got. So, but again, if you need to, the Q&A function may be under the three little dots that are on the bottom of your Zoom kind of screen. So if you don't see something that says Q&A, then you'll probably need to go to the more, which is under those three dots, and then find the question and answer Q&A button. Um, so I forgot to update the slide. No CLA credits will be applied for this session. I forgot to add in the no to this one. I apologize. That was a misprint on mine. I will fix that. But yeah, this is not going to be a CLE credited session. Next session should be, but this one is just going to be a whole lot of really awesome information. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan. And thank you very much. And I'll let you get on with it.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, I'm Dan Hilton. She mentioned I'm research manager with HousingLink. HousingLink is a Minneapolis-based nonprofit with a mission of connecting people to affordable rental homes, increasing choice and access for all. Next slide, please. We have a website that receives 30 to 40,000 visits a month from low to moderate income Minnesotans, as well as professionals who serve them, looking for an affordable place to live or any of a variety of resources we have to help navigate and understand the affordable rental housing landscape. but we're also engaged in research on rental housing market trends and supply. And a lot of our work is driven by two proprietary rental data sets. Next slide. Yeah. First is our streams database, which is a publicly accessible database of all rental properties and units in the state of Minnesota that are contractually obligated to provide affordable rent. The data is publicly available. You can visit our streams database and get information on affordable rental properties related to funding source, affordability, expiration date, location, and so on, and then download data to a CSV all free of charge. Next slide. And covering the private rental market is a rental review, which is a quarterly data set of private market rental vacancies, giving us insights into various rental market trends, ranging from median rent to composition of available units by bedroom size and building type. This one is a paid subscription for the data, but we do use that data to power a lot of free, publicly available reports and other resources, including some of the data I'm going to talk about today. So I did a couple of annual presentations as part of this series back in the pandemic days, and I'm not sure why I stopped it. I know it's called the Landlord Tenant webinar series, or I think that's what it's called, but I know the audience is actually a lot more diverse than that. It includes policymakers, housing advocates, and just plain like housing enthusiasts, in addition to the aforementioned landlords and tenants. So I'm going to try to keep things as broadly informative as possible today and provide you with an overview as to what I see as the key trends and forces acting on the rental market here locally. So first off, what is happening with median rents? And next slide. What is driving that? This is going to cover a variety of market forces and circumstances, the various things, both general economic trends that are to some extent out of our control, to policy interventions that are sort of like within our control, and a spectrum of other market factors that are somewhere in between. And then we're going to look at the resulting impact on affordable housing. Like, how does this petri dish of factors interact to influence the affordable housing situation in the Twin Cities? And then, there's been monumental changes in the best of times over the 15 years that I've worked in affordable housing, more than 15 years. And right now, with a combination of like economic destabilization and funding cuts and inflation, it's not super hard to have a gloomy perspective. But be that as it may, where do we go from here? And I will try my best to leave us all with a few notes of hope if you stick around to the end. So, what's going on with rents? So, for a little historic perspective, let's look at median two-bedroom apartment rents since the year 2011. I wish we could go back further, but I really want to use HousingLink data, and this is as far back as our rent data goes. But what I can tell you is if the unadjusted, because these figures are not inflation adjusted, but if the unadjusted dollar change over time that we see in the years since 2011 was mirrored in the years before, next slide. And that's actually not from, oops, back a couple. There we go. Yeah. That's not an actually data-driven line. I actually drew that one in, but I wanted to sort of just indicate like if that line kept going back before 2011, rents would have been at around $100 for a two-bedroom apartment in the year 2000. I was personally renting a two-bedroom apartment in the mid 90s, and it was, you know, fine, but we were paying like $685 a month. So understanding that it's against a backdrop of inflation, the reality is that in this past decade and a half, we've really seen some dynamic growth. And you can see here a couple of big, like really potentially disruptive historical backdrop events that have happened in the last decade and a half. Um, Again, I wish the chart went back a few more years in this because I'd like to show some stability in rents prior to this graph. But I started with HousingLink in 2009, right as the Great Recession was peaking. And thank you, HousingLink, for hiring me during the recession. But that was happening. And then more fresh in our memories now is the COVID-19 pandemic. And in both instances, you probably don't need to be an economist to bring to mind some of the basic and fundamental market disruptions we were experiencing during these two extraordinary periods. But I will mention a couple of things. Next slide. So there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll spend a minute here. But basically, there's two different axes. The rent line, which we were looking at before, is still orange, and you can see rent amount to the left of the graph. I've now added multifamily 5+ unit construction permits. So think of this primarily as apartment units in blue. And the axis for that is on the right, also in blue. The Great Recession just killed housing production in this country. Um, that permitting that you see through 2014 is historically low. And if you were to follow that blue line off I really like to talk about areas that are like not actually on my graph, but if you follow the blue line off to this left side of the graph, you'd see it dip down even lower. Housing market crashed in 2008. Construction fell behind new household creation, and that resulted in historically low vacancy rates. Basically, there were new households forming, but not enough apartments being built to house them. And when demand is higher than supply, economics 101, what happens? Rents were sent into this upward trajectory that lasted most of the previous decade. And this is all a gross oversimplification. And a little later on, I'm going to make a case that it's a rental housing mismatch issue as much as, or at least in addition to a housing supply issue. But at the same time, there's no doubt that housing construction falling off played a major role in rent increases over much of the last decade. But then, of course, what did that tremendous demand do for supply? Landlords were able to charge more for rent, and so that became an increasingly attractive market for developers who started boosting production. And you can see that very evidently in the graph as multifamily permitting ramped up tremendously in response to that need. As you see on this graph here, rents were 58% above what they were by the time we got to 2018. Rents were 58% above what they were in 2011, at least for two-bedroom apartments, according to HousingLink data. They were simply high. But lost amid that obviously difficult situation for local renters is the fact that, at least here locally, rents actually moderated a bit from that point on and through the pandemic. The pandemic itself was enormously disruptive to lives and markets and incomes, but an undertold story amid that other upheaval was a somewhat surprising period of stability in rents. And maybe that was all partly as a result of these new permitted units flooding the marketplace, and some of it was, as a result of landlords still hoping to be able to collect any rent during the extended eviction moratorium in Minnesota. But it may surprise you to know what you see here on this slide, that the median rent of a two-bedroom apartment in the Twin Cities in the fourth quarter of 2022 was actually less, albeit only 1.5% less than it was in the same quarter in 2018. Next slide, please. I'm actually going to stop here for a minute for a word about housing affordability as it relates to low-income renters. So just a second ago, I talked about rents moderating, and that was, of course, moderating after having gone up 58% in 7 years. So imagine a family that was having trouble paying for rent prior to the increase. Unless that family's income went up 58%, it's not like a period of stability for the overall market is going to make things suddenly affordable for them. There's a persistent need for affordable housing that's not being met and really cannot currently be met through the private market without some sort of public policy intervention. And I have what I think is a really good way of illustrating that. Uh, so this graph is lifted directly out of our monthly Minneapolis rental housing brief series. Our rent data is based on advertised vacancies. And so what we're doing here is saying, out of all advertised rental vacancies, what percent is affordable to different bands of area median income. And so you see here, if you're making, full area median income, 100% of area median income, which was roughly $124,000 a year for a family of four in the Twin Cities in 2024, 99% of all vacancies are affordable to you. Uh, in, uh, and on the other end of the spectrum, if your household makes 30% of the area median, and that's what HUD would define as extremely low income, that would be about $37,000 a year for a family of four. Literally none of the private market vacancies we saw in Minneapolis in February were affordable to that level of income. Now, this is based on an affordability standard that says that housing is affordable if it costs no more than 30% of a household's income. So for sure, there's plenty of families making under 30% AMI that have to live in places that are not considered affordable to them, but somehow manage by making sacrifices or doubling up or whatnot. But what I mean when I say that the private market is not set up, or this is what I mean when I say that the private market's not set up to serve really low income folks. And I'll just stray further from the main presentation to make one additional point, which is that so much about the affordable industry is based on affordability relative to area median income. So how households qualify for different programs or how different housing programs cap the rents they can charge. Like for example, the popular low income housing tax credit program or Section 42 commonly will require units to be affordable to 60% or 50% of AMI. Next slide, please. But the Twin Cities area median income for a family of four went from over $90,000 in 2017 to over $124,000 in 2024. So suddenly a lot more units appear affordable. If you're just talking about what percentage of the market is affordable to 60% AMI, units that only had to be affordable to a family making $54,240 now have to be affordable to a family making $74,520 in a span of 7 years. Now, these median incomes are not based on nothing. Wages have gone up for a lot of people. But if you're in a family that's still making in 2024 about what you were in 2017, it doesn't matter to you that the median went up. You're getting crushed by rising rents, or you might be getting crushed even if rents stabilize because it wasn't affordable to you to begin with. So that's my little sidetrack, just a general warning about discussing housing affordability using broad brush measures. Housing affordability is ultimately an individual thing. What's affordable to an individual family given their individual circumstances. I'm going to do one more sidetrack, a sidetrack from my sidetrack. So do you remember me saying something about there being a rental housing mismatch issue as well as a regular old supply issue? So from the years of 2019 to 2023, renters making over $100,000 a year as a percent of all renter households grew by 40%. So basically, more higher income renters as a percentage of all renters. And maybe some of that portion was aspiring home buyers who found themselves like priced out of the ownership market or maybe just not ready to take the plunge as interest rates rose. Or maybe some of the portion is comprised of like organic growth of income among renters, like renter households that were making under $100,000 a year that are now making more. But regardless, every rental unit occupied by renters making over $100,000 a year is one rental unit not available for those making less. And it's not like the folks looking for luxury units are necessarily in direct competition with extremely low income folks, but it is kind of like musical chairs. So people making over $100,000 a year also want a good deal. So maybe they're taking some of the units that are affordable to those making $80,000 a year, and those making $80,000 a year start taking some of the units affordable to those making $60,000 a year, and so on. And not every unit affordable to low income folks is being occupied by low income folks, especially the private market ones. Now, to the extent that some of these upper income renters are representing like a latent aspiring group of future homeowners that are currently waiting out the market, there is a universe in which a loosening of the ownership market would have a positive effect on the overall market as like swaths of people move from the rental to the ownership market. But with interest rates and house prices where they're at, that's not really where we're at right now. I will mention that mismatches can occur in ways other than income. You can have a mismatch in geography. So imagine a small town where young adults are moving away. They might have a surplus of housing, but lack jobs or other incentives for people to move there, even while there's not nearly enough units in other parts of the state. Or there can be a mismatch of housing type. Next slide, please. We're just starting to explore some of our own search data on the HousingLink website, and we are finding that there's more demand relative to supply for some bedroom sizes. And this particular metric I'm showing here, driven by our data, is very specifically measuring demand for affordable housing, but it definitely tracks with what we know anecdotally, that there is a lack of supply of rental housing for those with the larger families. We're just kind of dipping our toe into this line of inquiry, so more to follow on this. But just note that in addition to an overall shortage of housing units, matters can be further complicated by a mismatch of the right units in the right place at the right price. So now back to the main presentation. So where we were talking about rents stabilizing a bit during the pandemic. Next slide, please. That was 2022 though, and this is now. So in just the 2 years from Q3 2022 to Q3 2024, rents for two-bedroom apartments were up another 15%. You can see it fell off a little there at the end of 2024, and our new numbers for median rents for Q1 should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So we'll see whether that's um, indicative of any sort of trend that's beginning. But next slide, please. If we add 5+ unit multifamily permitting back in, you can see that that has really, really fallen off in the last couple of years. So unless something shifts, I do fear that we're going to be headed back into that whole cycle again where units permitted falls behind new household creation. And you know what that looked like a few slides ago in terms of its impact on rents. So if we think that lack of rental housing supply, which we have evidence of here in multifamily permitting, is a major contributor to rising rents, then we want to ask what is constraining supply? What's keeping housing developers from building new units? And why are they not building? The first thing I'll mention is that the cost to develop is going up. Next slide. And that starts with interest rates. So the effective federal funds rate is a standard measure of interest rates. And we can see how those have ratcheted up like really sharply since the pandemic. It's more daunting to take out a loan from a multifamily developer the same as it is for an individual home buyer. Next slide. And then there's inflation, which I probably don't even need to mention because we all feel this one. It's when economic theory comes to life. There was this historic spike in inflation, and while inflation levels have come back down, let's be clear, this is not a graph of prices. Prices did not go back down for the most part. This is a graph of inflationary change over 12 months prior. So each of these increases builds on previous increases. And for housing developers, this comes in the cost of wood, concrete, land, hammers. You get the idea. Next slide. And then wage growth. And it's kind of the same story here. Again, each of these increases is building on previous increases. Wages locked in a sort of death's embrace with inflation. And of course, we all love to see workers get paid more, but that means that housing developers are having to pay people more to build the housing units. Next slide. Then there's costs to manage that are going up. Next slide. Just as in housing development, those who manage apartments are impacted by inflation every time, they replace a refrigerator or put on a new roof and utilities that they're paying for and so on. Cost of wages, same deal here too. Landlords have to pay staff, so leasing agents, maintenance, etc. Next slide. And then there's insurance costs. And this is a really big one. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis published a really great article a month or two ago about the impact of rising insurance rates on the multifamily housing industry. There's a lot of sobering statistics and anecdotes in the article, but I did recreate this one chart which summarizes findings from their survey of 35 property management companies. And here you see the median year over year percent change in insurance premiums. And mind you, the four states that encompassed the properties in question are in the upper Midwest. So it's not really the part of the country that's experiencing the most volatility in terms of natural disasters from climate change. But it's at the point where we're all bearing the burden for more frequent and catastrophic floods, fires, and hurricanes, thanks again to climate change. Next slide. And then I made this slideshow initially back in March, but decided to circle back around on it next week for anything that might have changed and decided to slip this little thing in there. And then next slide. Hostile policy. Okay, I want to talk just a minute about what I'm going to call hostile policy, but it's policy that is considered hostile, whether in a real or perceived way by multifamily developers and owner operators, and arguing like benefits and risks of rent stabilization and tenant protection policy is kind of out of scope for this presentation. But I do think it's fair to consider that there is a policy intervention that can, and hear me out, it can both be a benefit to tenants and it can manifest itself in additional expense or pain on the part of landlords. And I think, like with all policy, it's really hard and not always super popular to recognize multiple seemingly contradictory perspectives. But I think that good faith policy discussion has to do that, or what are we doing? That there's some give and take in a lot of things. Next slide, please. All right, this is my own creation. I know I'm missing some stuff, but I took a stab here at trying to think of the major policy interventions in both of the two core cities as well as at the statewide level in the years since 2017. And this is a timeline, the best I can do for now, but it would probably be better represented like in 3D, showing a complex web of different policies, rent stabilization, zoning reforms, tenant protections, developer incentives, and how they all interact, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes contradicting each other. My intent here was to put the stuff that puts more of a burden on housing developers and landlords in orange, and the stuff that would theoretically relieve a burden in blue. Um, but some of these could be argued a couple different ways. And my whole point is that policy impacts are many and they're varied, and they can be very difficult to disentangle and isolate in order to prove anything. But trade-offs need to be recognized in any policy discussion. Uh, Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to try to attempt to head off a potential question that I might get after like the last slide and some of the stuff I've just been talking about, or a potential assumption. I think it is worth noting a lot of the policies on the preceding slide were Minneapolis and St. Paul specific, and talk around housing policy in those two core cities in particular is highly politicized, and people are pretty fast to declare a causation for specific policies if permitting and rent trends support their bias. But this is here is a wider view of the metro, looking at that 5+ unit multifamily permitting data again. And while there's no doubt that permitting has fallen to a trickle in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the last year, you can see that in large part the suburban metro is tracking in a pretty similar way over time, albeit in an area with a little over 3 times the population. My own personal view is that the impact of most housing policy that doesn't target development specifically in a sweeping manner is probably getting dwarfed by the impact of macroeconomic trends. In other words, you can have 5 local housing ordinances, but if insurance costs go up 40% in 2 years and there's tariffs on construction supplies, that's what's going to make the lines in a graph like this really tank. That said, making new developments feasible can be a game of inches. So I think it's also reasonable to consider straws that can break proverbial camelbacks in terms of whether projects can be considered economically viable or not. But in general, I think that like local policies, again, unless they're specifically targeting development, that it's kind of more like a scalpeling stuff along the edge, and macroeconomic things that are happening like recessions and inflation and so on are more like the chainsaws that impact things. Next slide. So where do we go from here? Rents are up, permitting is down, and the economy is feeling rather volatile at the moment. Next slide. Well, as I mentioned, I was going to attempt to end my presentation with a couple of notes of hope. First off, renters are resilient. So I've always liked the measure of housing cost burden. It's a way of taking both income and housing cost into account, with the idea that one is considered cost burdened if they spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. And I just gave you all these scary stats about housing and 2 historic crises that stressed our housing market over the past decade and a half. And yet, aside from a pandemic era spike, we've actually seen a very slight decrease in percent of Twin Cities rental households that are cost burdened over that time. Now, this rate is perpetually hovering in the upper 40s, lower 50% range, and that is literally a crisis. So maybe it's a stretch to say, well, it's not getting worse is a sign of hope. But I do think it says something about the resiliency of individual renter families through rapidly changing economic times, that it's not getting worse and in fact getting just a little better over time. But bigger than that, and I think an actual cause for hope is this notion, and it's a concept or phrase I heard mentioned at a recent housing conference. Next slide, please. Which is over the past 5 years, there's been a shift in the discussion of affordable housing from it's their problem to it's our problem. Just a handful of election cycles ago, you could not get politicians to address affordable housing on the national stage. And suddenly, even amidst a political climate that's as divisive as this country has seen, presidential candidates from both major political parties were publicly floating strategies to tackle housing affordability. More to the point, and more locally, there's a group of housing advocates that actually has support from politicians on both sides of the aisle, representing a coalition called Housing First Minnesota that's advancing a series of what I would say are good faith legislative initiatives designed to spur housing development. If you remember that web of policy from the timeline a few slides ago, that here's where I'd put some of those legislative initiatives that are currently being advanced, all of them in the camp of making it a little easier on developers to produce more housing units. The coalition really works to find the sorts of compromises that feature the easing of regulation that conservatives tend to like, and policies that encourage density, which progressives tend to like. And you can't have legislators getting behind this kind of stuff if they're not hearing it from their constituents. So I think the fact that they are hearing it from their constituents suggests that there really might be sort of a burgeoning public will to do something about housing affordability. It's kind of like officially on the radar. Um, that actually, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. And this would be a time to
Yeah.
do question. I kind of flew through that.
I-
Um, but
it's a lot of really interesting and fascinating
mm,
data. Quick question for you, just before we kind of get into some
mm,
of the questions that have popped up here is how can you go a little bit more into how you all collect this data?
sure. So we are an affordable housing website and we have affordable listings on our website, but our rent data is not, I don't know if it's a misconception or if it's just not known at all, but it's kind of the full gamut of private market rental vacancy. So we are it's advertised vacancies. We actually have a tie into listing feeds from a number of management companies in the area. Even like what we call the shadow market of like single family duplex condo and townhome from like Renters Warehouse and a number of like other large management companies in the area. So it's actual rent data from actual um, property management companies.
Okay, fantastic. So, um, do you have a sense, just percentage wise, of how, or number wise, how many rentals are there just in Minnesota? Do you have any sense of that?
You mean how many rental units are in the state?
Or yeah, like, or how many renter households are, I
So
guess.
I think a few years back it would have grown a little bit, but it was a little over 600,000 rental households.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or no, six or a little over 600,000 rental units, of which about 140,000 have some level of public intervention or subsidy. So
Mm-hmm.
anything from tax credit um, to public housing or whatever.
Sure. So then, if presuming just because the rental market, obviously there's not as many buildings being built,
Yeah.
that's probably a similar number now. Um, but do you
Yeah,
have,
well,
mhm.
I'd say that there was a lot of sort of there was a lot of projects still in the fire hose as recently
Mm-hmm.
as 3 or 4 years ago. But yeah, I would say probably safely you could say under 650,000.
Yeah. Okay. And then, but you were also saying that the number of renters has probably gone up in the last few years for various reasons, like, yeah, inability to purchase homes and such like that. So if the number of units hasn't increased, but the number of potential renters has increased, you were talking about how that puts more pressure on the market.
Yeah, in both the renter and ownership market. And that was a problem we had coming out of the Great Recession was just with development being stoppered up. And so that's where you end up with that when I say like renters are resilient and everybody's kind of resilient. That's when you get into situations with like maybe kids are staying living at home longer with their parents or more people are doubling up or living with a roommate or whatever. It's just people are going to kind of find the situation that works for them. But definitely there's a vacancy, a low-ish vacancy rate issue kind of in both um, renter and ownership markets.
Mhm. And then last question, I think just of what was kind of bubbling up for me to the top, was most of your data was kind of focused on the a metro area. Do
Yeah.
you all collect anything from greater Minnesota, or is it mostly going to be from the metro area?
We do have some statewide data. It's generally not as robust. We have a couple reports, and anyone is welcome to go on housinglink.org. There's a research drop-down menu with a lot of publicly available reports and resources, and
Hmm.
many of them are periodic, so they're being updated either monthly in the case of our rental housing briefs or quarterly in terms of a Hennepin County overview we have. And then we have some
Hmm.
annual reports, including a Minnesota housing measures which is tracking housing supply in the state and housing affordability. Percent of the market affordable to 30% AMI, percent of the market affordable to 60% AMI for the entire state. Our sample sizes aren't as large in greater Minnesota, but we do cover that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I have, in case people were missing it, I have dropped links to all of that stuff. I did at the beginning, and I also just did that again now. So, if folks are interested in getting more data, if you're a data nerd and you like the whole, numbers and spreadsheets and collating and, I enjoy that as well. I get you. I see you. Hello, my people. Um,
I appreciate you putting all those links in there.
yeah, absolutely. That's one of my functions here. So, all right. We only had two pre-submitted questions that came through. And one of them is not necessarily specific, really relevant to this particular topic. I'm going to answer that one here in my capacity as a housing attorney through Homeline, but I want to focus first, just so you're aware, everyone who's here listening, and I'm going to focus on the questions that are Dan specific so that we can maybe, make sure that we're being respectful of Dan's time. So first thing first, so the question I had gotten before was, is Section 8 housing at risk due to current legislation? And this is from Carrie, who is a tenant.
So I I sort of feel like it would be like dangerous for me to just like speculate. I think
Right.
just based on what we know of the behavior of the administration, the current administration, I can't imagine that they're going to be, enormously supportive of many assistance programs that we have. I know there was last I knew, and somebody here who's more into like sort of um, advocacy might have a more of a finger on the pulse. But last I knew, I thought that Section 8 funding was in the House um, bill was at 2024 levels was the proposal, but of course
Hmm.
it should be inflation adjusted or else it can't provide the same level of services. And of course we know that HUD itself is being like there have been large staff reductions, so it's going to be harder to manage the program. Um, so I think some level of concern is probably warranted, but I don't know if anyone can speak more to specifically to.
I don't think anyone can at this point.
Yeah, can we speak
I don't
specifically
think
on what's going
anyone,
to
yeah,
happen next week? Yes, but
exactly.
yeah, but I do think last I knew, I think the
Hmm.
program was set to have the same levels of funding it did last year, at least in the House proposal.
Yeah. And um, okay, so then one of the things that I wanted to point out, I know I had talked about this because this is how I usually like tell other people about housing. Like housing, you do all so much stuff. Like it's so cool. But one of the number one recommendations I have to send folks to your website is for that housing search option, because HousingLink is one of the places that you work with landlords and other organizations specifically who have said that they work with particular subsidies or work with potentially less than perfect backgrounds, if you've got like a criminal background or less than perfect credit, that sort of thing. And so when you are in that sort of situation, HousingLink is like the first place that we will send people to go to. And so the reason that question, I want to preface that, is that the question about is how Section 8 housing at risk is that y'all have a lot of data about like what, how many people are kind of out there and what landlords and such are kind of working with those subsidies. So it's a reasonable question to ask because it's something that you guys are also kind of keep track of.
Yeah, and I should mention that if you have a voucher, the Housing Link search feature allows you to show only listings where landlords have indicated that they're open to accepting a voucher, which is not something that all rental search tools have. You can search specifically for different types of subsidized housing, and we also have a subsidized housing a metro area um, waiting list. Just kind of it's an ongoing feature where you could just see it from all the metro area housing authorities which have open spots on their wait, like which ones have open waiting lists. So, and
Mhm.
then I'll just mention, just since we're kind of on the topic, that there's a lot of fact, like tip sheets and so on. So, like, how to rent with bad credit, or how to, just kind of how to navigate and understand the different affordable housing world. We kind of try to make it a bit of a one-stop shop without being too overwhelming.
Yeah, no, there's so much great information in there. So, um, kudos to you all, and especially like the data collection is, again, love it. Okay, that's enough side talk for us. Sorry. I'm going to move back to Cheryl. You had a question right away. I am not certain that I can answer this. Dan, if you have any insight into this particular program, Cheryl was wondering about when they moved in their townhouse. It was a Section 42, which is a low-income housing tax credit property. Uh, Lura, Lura. The Lura expired in 2023, but they were supposed to have a 3-year protection period until
Mhm.
2026, where the rent wasn't supposed to exceed the gross rent limits during. Uh, but the rent went up 6.5% last year. So, do you have any information, I guess, about you know, I don't. I'm not particularly familiar with that program. I don't know if you are either, and what those kind of renter restriction protections are. If you have a
Yeah,
sense of that.
I'm really not.
Yeah,
I honestly, I would probably refer somebody like that to Homeline if I,
sure.
yeah,
And if we get, I just don't know it off the top of
yeah,
my head,
yeah,
Cheryl.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
if,
I don't have.
yeah, we can certainly do the research into that. You might want to call us or actually email us, might even be better because then we can respond back and forth with that. I'm sorry that I don't know it off the top of my head. As to, I know that LIHTC and different subsidy programs have different limitations and about rent increases and how often they can do it and how much they can increase. So, yeah, I just was punting to see if you had any
Mhm.
idea about that. That's fair. So yeah, Cheryl, if you want to, otherwise, I will also drop here in a second the some of the Section 42 compliance sheets that we have or for Minnesota Housing has that might also be used for you as well. Okay. So, um, so then we're going to go on to, there's two anonymous questions here. And one is that, is there any data sets that show the relationship of other cost factors that could impact a household's income as it relates to housing affordability? For example, in general, it is known that childcare costs have exponentially increased post-pandemic. Is there any data out there that shows this phenomena as it relates to households' ability to rent or even buy?
So I can't think of anything that's really easily available. Look, like Homeline would like to answer this question live. Maybe you have a good answer, or I don't know if I'm interpreting that right, but I will say that there was a measure that was out for a while called H plus T, which was housing plus transportation, with the idea that a lot of people were moving farther and farther from the urban core, with the idea they could get more house for the money, but they weren't properly taking into account the cost it took to drive from that location and maintain a vehicle that could do that commute. And so the idea that your housing plus transportation cost should not exceed 50%, and they had based on where you lived and different factors, you could sort of get a customized look at that. But I think that it's such a complex measure because it's not just, there's like childcare costs, but also just simple things about like, do you have a lot of household debt? Or, is enormously impactful on what money you have left over for rent or transportation or whatnot. So I don't know if there's anything easily digestible. Um, And it is, in fact, it's one of the reasons why in the presentation I'm saying it's really such an individual circumstance. Like it's such a broad brush to just say housing costs, because what does that mean relative to all the different factors that could be going
Hmm.
on in someone's circumstance?
Yeah, and you make a good point of like, 30% of your income was kind of the number that was reached back in what the 70s
Yeah,
of what it would be reasonable to spend. But if you have a lot of debt, which a lot of people do these days, all of a sudden even 30% of your income towards housing is a lot when you have 80% of your income needs to go towards debt payments.
yeah.
So there's no good answer for that. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any data either that kind of correlates, but in general, the gen rule is that ideally a household is not spending more than 30% of their income, of their monthly income on housing.
Yeah.
And now, does housing related expenses, do you know, is that just like literally just like your mortgage payment on your rent, or it could
It's
also be,
all associated costs.
okay.
So actually, in our measure that we have, where we're looking at the percent AMI affordable, we're trying to take into account like all the utilities, and like the likelihood you would be responsible for utilities is higher if you live in a rental single family home than if you live in a multifamily development and so on. So
Mhm.
depending on the type of unit and the number of bedrooms is going to impact how much those different costs are. So we're trying to adjust it around. But yeah, it's theoretically, and for owners, it would include like, property tax and insurance.
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to say, I wonder if insurance, because we're seeing an uptick, I know, in landlords who are requiring tenants to have like renters insurance as part of living on their properties. So,
Yeah, and
uh,
I do actually wonder if we're going to see an uptick in cost burden numbers for owners
mhm.
due to these increases in insurance premiums.
Yeah, since we're seeing that shift, I'm wondering if that's kind of in response to the increased insurance premiums that property owners are having to take on as well,
Yeah.
and they're trying to shift some of that liability off to their tenants. Um, I mean, in general, I think having if you are a landlord or a renter, I think you should have your own insurance. I think that's just a
Mhm.
very smart thing to do. But it's also like, it's a numbers game
Yeah.
oftentimes of like what you can actually afford to have or not have. I know when I was in college and I had my little one-bedroom apartment with my sister, we did not have renter's insurance
Yeah.
because we couldn't afford an extra, you know, rent was only $575 at that point. Like, I'm sure that same apartment rents for about, 1,200 at least right now. Um, but yeah, just as a general insurance, if you can
Mm.
afford it, is just a good, nice thing to have. All right. So sorry, Nav, so we don't have any like specific data sets for you, but a nice little random deep dive into what does their housing affordability actually mean. So do you know, are we seeing an increase in migration of people from other states or cities impacting the rental availability in the Twin Cities?
So the Twin Cities is growing, and it is growing. There's a lot of areas in greater Minnesota that are seeing their populations decrease. I think overall in the state, we are not one of the higher population growth states. I think we see that as we like risk losing representation in Congress as, populations of states like Texas and the Carolinas increase. Um, I think that kind of the composition and demographics, there's a shift in our population, but growth is not particularly high. But I know if you go to um, the Met Council, they do a lot of really great forecasts on population growth and demographic shifts, and um, I think you'd probably get a lot more useful answers by just seeing some of their data on their website than I would be able to give beyond what I just said.
Just drop the link to their website in the chat for everybody. Yeah, Met Council has a lot of good data for in the Twin Cities area. I know anecdotally when we're talking with folks on the phones and things like that, it's always a struggle for anyone who's kind of outside of the metro area. If they need to move housing, you know, oftentimes if they want to stay in their same area, where they're at right now is the only like affordable housing in their area. And so it's so if that's going away or something has happened, then oftentimes folks just need to move, and oftentimes where they can find spaces to be is going to be more in the metro area because there's just a higher number of rental units available. Although I think you had pointed out like the rental unit rate availability
Mhm.
is potentially lower in the metro than it is
Yeah.
in other places. I don't
Well, I
know.
think that's part of that the mismatch thing. So like
Hmm.
there's actually in greater Minnesota, you're more likely, depending on where you look to find like in the Twin Cities, you'll almost never find a subsidized unit that's just vacant and available. It's you're getting on a waiting list. In greater Minnesota, you might find a community where they don't have all their public housing units filled, but it also means that a person that moves there is going to have to, be able to get employed and, maybe they have the employers there, maybe they don't, but there's just a lot of other factors that, the units might not be there, but there might not be an incentive to move there. I should mention yeah, as it was mentioned before, Met Council, more of a metro thing. There's a state demographer also. There probably are state demographic and population projections that would be knowable also with a little Googling.
I am totally going to drop that in here right now because I never even thought to look at that, and that's amazing. Make sure I actually spell the word demographer properly. All right, y'all, go and collect data. It's beautiful. Um, so yeah, that's the state drop Met Council, Minnesota State Demographer or Demographic Center. Um, okay, so then Melanie has a kind of a series of questions. Well, not all questions, some just also information about something we were talking about actually before we started about how, if there are any suggestions, and I don't know if you do or not. This is probably outside the scope of, this particular presentation, but is there anything that folks can do to try and, you know, mitigate some of these increased costs and prices and things like that? I believe Melanie's probably coming from the rental perspective or the home buying perspective, so like not the developing perspective, but the like actually purchasing or renting perspective.
Um, yeah, it's a rough outlook, and we were talking before the session started. I have a couple kids that are sort of in various stages of kind of getting out onto their own and sort of thinking about what home ownership looked like for me as a prospect when I was, I'm a 54-year-old guy now, and it was a little when I was getting out of college in 1993, it was not the same thing. I, I a lot of this is like references to people or organizations that can answer these questions better than me. But for this one, I will say that Minnesota Home Ownership Center would be able to answer this better than me in terms of like what they're going to do. A lot of what they're working on is trying to sort of like what is that bridge that can help people that want to make that move from renting to ownership. So I do think to that point that I said about how it's on the table now. So like how do we build more units? How do we get people placed in, like how do we make help people basically how do we just allow people to sort of like live in the communities that they've always lived in and stay there. And the Center for Energy and Environment, another link. Um, I've used them personally for some like programs in our house, but they have a lot of programs that are city or in Minneapolis or St. Paul neighborhood specific where they'll like below market loans or bridge loans or down payment assistance programs that are available. So through them or the state or Minnesota Home Ownership Center, I'm sure has
Mhm.
resources of that type. But just, I think the way I said that the private market is not set up to serve really low income folks, and it's like the private market is not currently set up for people who have, that are significantly below median income to be able to buy without some sort of intervention. So I think my recommendation would be to look for where those interventions are, where there's down payment assistance programs and so on. And to the extent, when you're renting, that you're able to share that cost burden with, another income earner. I mean, that makes more difference than like anything else. But that's not perfect answer, but that's the best answer I can
Yeah,
offer.
I mean, there's never going to be a perfect answer when it comes to all this. It's like, as we've been seeing, as the affordable housing, discussion has been ongoing now for over a decade. It's complicated. There's lots of, as you were pointing out, like there's lots of factors that get into this. As we've also been discussing today, like with our questions of folks, there's lots of other things that come in that can impact a person's ability to afford a home, whether
Mhm.
that's owning the home or renting the home. And it's also a lot of impact and factors about even building those homes in the first place or upkeeping those homes. That's the other, there's the concept of a lot of the homes that existed before are supposed to kind of, as they age, then become more affordable, and they're supposed to
Mhm.
be it's not quite trickle down economics, but it's kind of like an akin to, there should be more affordable homes around as the housing ages, but it costs. When does that housing become not habitable, and like when is it too expensive to upkeep and things like that? And that's where we're also seeing a lot of that affordable or deeply affordable housing is also maybe not actually safe to live in. And
Mhm.
how do you deal with all of that? So yeah, this whole thing everyone, it's complicated,
Yeah.
right?
The other thing I'd mention on the ownership piece is it's especially in like Minneapolis and St. Paul or any of the sort of more inner ring suburbs, like you can't like expand outward and build new single family lots. So
Hmm.
there's a constraint there. And so I think, ownership doesn't necessarily have to mean owning a single family home, as some of these policies come on the table for density, encouraging density. Maybe ownership means owning, a townhome or a condo, but then at least you're in something where you have some equity being built. If you do want to stay kind of more in the um in the urban core, um, and though that's where so like in terms of if people listening today are getting involved in the political process and trying to work with their representatives and encourage stuff like encouraging density so that like there can be simply more units so that not every unit
Hmm.
is as expensive, and maybe there can be more ownership units which take some of that renter population and house them. And it's just, it's not obvious. It's often said, but like there's not a silver bullet, but like every little way that we can sort of chip away at this is going to be useful.
Yeah. Housing is one of those things we all just kind of need, right?
Right.
All right. JJ was wondering if you have any data about move-in costs and the increase in move-in costs and accessibility. We're finding a situation where there are more and more random pre-move-in fees, for example, holding fees required at time of applying, lease
Mhm.
origination fees at the time of lease signing, increases in application fees, etc.
So it's not something I have studied. This sounds related to that thing that you were saying about owners passing along costs, finding
Hmm.
different ways to try to pass in costs. And I know that that's it. I know that that's sometimes an unintended consequence with some tenant protection things is they'll be like, you can no longer charge this fee unless, well, we'll charge this fee and that fee and that fee. And I don't know if it some of it has to do with that. And it may be worth, I don't know, Rachel, if you have any thought about if like something like that, does that make you go like, wait a minute, maybe something in that isn't legal or
Yes,
okay.
I have several thoughts on that.
Yeah, take over.
So um, we just don't have like necessarily the data around it. So yeah, there's a lot of I tend to call it the Ticketmaster effect on a lot of housing, and where rent will be kind of advertised as one thing, but there's a bunch of like maybe application fees or holding fees that are being charged up front that make it so that it's actually more expensive, or maybe there's like extra monthly fees that will then bump the rent up from something that someone can afford, like say it's $1,000 a month, but then all of a sudden there's $200 in fees that you also have to take into account. There are a lot of laws on Minnesota books surrounding what fees are allowed or how much or when they can be charged or when they have to be returned. So yes, there's a lot of legislation on that as well. And the one I'm going to put in here right now is probably the most recent law that was added in conjunction with this is 504B.120. And I know this is not supposed to be a CLE, everybody, so I'm going to try and limit the amount of actual statutory number and language that I'm going to talk about. But this one is called prohibitive fees. And what this was supposed to try and do when it passed was that it's not prohibiting landlords from charging fees. It's just that it has to be something that is disclosed upfront, and it should be advertised as the entire part of the rent. So like, if you do have, say your base rent is $1,000, but you also have $200 in what are called non-optional fees. Those are fees that you don't have a choice as a tenant to pay or not. They're just, maybe they're your amenity fee, or maybe it's your administrative fee. We see a lot of that sort of thing. Or you get like a monthly service fee to pay your rent. You have to pay, or you have a monthly service fee to pay your utilities or something like that. All of those fees should be included in the advertised rent and then also disclosed in some sort of cover sheet. And that statute 504B.120 kind of goes through that. Um, Now, I would say if there are, specific situations, folks should call us and we can kind of walk through, because yeah, there are rules around what are called pre-lease deposits. Those are the deposits, or sometimes they're called holding fees. Again, Rose banding their name, still a Rose. Holding fee, pre-lease deposit, they're all going to be the same. If you're paying money to kind of hold on to the rental, then there are rules about how that's supposed to be handled. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of rules around fees. Application fees also have a lot of regulation around them, just because landlords are not supposed to charge more than what they actually cost to do the application processing. And so, but you know, prices are going up just about anywhere, as Dan was saying, in a lot of this. So maybe those application, processing fees are going up because the background check companies are increasing their fees. But it's also worth asking potentially, if you're seeing it consistently going up and up and up, is all right, is this actually what you're being charged for to do this thing? You know, Side rant from me. One of the problems that a lot of the rules that we do have is that there isn't necessarily like an enforcement mechanism or a penalty in place if you do find or that a landlord is not following the rules properly. So there, give us a call if you find that out. We'll try and figure out what to do from there. But it may be a very frustrating experience for everyone involved, is I guess what I'm trying to warn everybody. Um, so that's my fee rant. Sorry, Dan.
That's all right.
All right. That was it for our Q&A questions. And then we had one other pre-submitted question that I can also answer just real quick. Someone had asked us about, let me go grab it here. Dee had asked about being told that by a building inspector that they had to get a licensed mold specialist to confirm the mold. Mold is the worst. It absolutely is, because it's so complicated. Some people are very much negatively impacted by it, some people are not. And it is something that, without an expert opinion, most city inspection units that I'm aware of are just not necessarily qualified to identify what is actually mold or what is actually mildew or anything like that. So that is often the case where you do have to go in and get your own mold specialist to come and actually confirm that something is mold. But if you do that, then you know it's mold, and your landlord has to kind of sort that out. So, it might be in your landlord's best interest to do that themselves, just so that they have the control in the situation. But um, yeah, unfortunately, not unusual response. So that sucks, and I'm sorry. All right, so that was it for all of our questions. We only had about 20 minutes left, so actually we did really well. Unless there's anything else that you would like to kind of touch on or reiterate again, Dan. This has been such a great presentation with all of this data and information. So I really appreciate you taking the time to put it all together. I imagine that, especially with the uncertainty in
Mm.
the economy, I'm sure that was a fun month of having to go back in and redo everything.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and yeah, it was maybe a little shorter than these are sometimes, but hopefully people don't mind that they can get out in the nice weather a little bit earlier.
It's true. Yeah, here we go.
Um,
20 minutes back. That is absolutely all right. I'm not going to complain about getting some more sunshine in my life. So, and thank you all very much for joining us today. Again, the recording will be up on our website in a couple of days. So feel free if you've got additional questions or information to reach out to us and we'll see what we can do to help you out. All right. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.